Welcome back to Indyfest 2021. I'm Jon Ralston, the editor of the Nevada Independent. Thanks again to everyone who's joining us for this two-day policy conference. We're halfway through the first day. We had some great focus groups and some poll results released in the morning. Had a great afternoon. We have a couple of focus groups, one of Democrats, one of Republicans, and later I'm going to sit down to chat with Nate Silver, the internationally renowned data guru, about all kinds of topics. You'll be able to ask Nate questions too. But first, we have a real treat, something I'm really excited about, with two very talented high school debaters from Palo Verde right here in Las Vegas. I want to thank the Realtors for sponsoring this debate between these gentlemen. Matthew Lin and Ethan Shao are here. And let me tell you before I get out of the way and let these professionals go at it, what they will be debating. And it is this: resolved, the United States federal government should substantially increase its protection of water resources in the United States. The affirmative argument, and that's going to be Ethan, will be proposing a plan that he thinks the U.S. federal government should adopt. And the negative, that's Matthew, will be responding with reasons why that's a bad idea or alternative that things might be better. We're going to start with Ethan, who is going to talk about why he believes in the affirmative. Ethan, take it away.
Across the nation, a water collapse is impending. 2020 National Geographic cites that America is running out of water. Within 50 years, many regions of the United States could see their freshwater supply reduced by a third. Of all the freshwater basins that channel rain and snow into rivers, nearly half may be unable to meet consumer demands by 2071. In Nevada, the problem of water shortage is particularly acute. As of August 6, 2021, the federal government declared a water shortage on the Colorado River for the first time, triggering mandatory water consumption cuts for states in the Southwest. Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the U.S. by volume, is at around 35% full, its lowest since the 1930s. Nevada relies on this water for 70% of its supply. In southern Nevada, that number's around 90%. With cuts incoming, the time for protection is long overdue. Therefore, the United States federal government should substantially increase its protection of water resources in the U.S., focusing specifically on Nevada policies. One of the best ways to do this is by implementing agricultural incentives and subsidies that encourage sustainable crops over water-intensive ones. Allow me to explain. According to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, 85% of water across the nation is accorded solely to irrigated agriculture. However, with less and less water available for use, that burden is gradually becoming too great. For instance, alfalfa hay is a massive tax on Nevada water supplies. As the leading cash crop of the state, its immense expenditure dominates consumption. In fact, in the western U.S., nearly half of the Colorado River's water goes to irrigating just cattle crops, with 32% going to alfalfa. The needs of this plant, among others like corn and grass, are ill-equipped for dry environments, exceeding our capacity to provide. Some farmers have even allowed their fields to become fallow in response to shortages. More than ever, it's time to transition to more conscientious alternatives in farming. The federal government can and should support water-conservative crops. Teff, a desert grain from Ethiopia, is a prime example of this. As a high-energy feed for cows, one of the main focuses of Western agriculture, teff could easily take over the economic role of alfalfa without its inherent harms. Preliminary reports indicate that teff requires less irrigation water than alfalfa for comparable forage yields. The University of Nevada, Reno Cooperative Extension has researched teff for over 7 years and estimates that teff requires approximately 50 to 70% as much water as alfalfa to produce an economic crop. Similarly, in the southern part of the state, a 5-year study has focused on using spineless prickly pear cactus for consumption, feed, and biofuel. Results of the study, which took place in Logandale, Nevada, showed that prickly pear had the highest fruit production while using up to 80% less water than traditional crops. In addition, the cactus provides food for sheep and cattle production in drought conditions. Sorghum, another alternative grain, is beginning to revive on the high plains in response to water shortages from Nebraska to Texas. Appropriately named the camel of the crops, it takes 1/3 less water than corn, according to NPR. With its recent increase in demand, sorghum has the potential to rival rice and wheat. These alternatives, just a few of many, are more than capable of taking a role in national agriculture, seamlessly adopting the same roles as their counterparts while avoiding any harsh drawbacks. Of course, the goal here isn't to replace current crops altogether. That's not a realistic proposal. Instead, it's about reducing overall consumption while maintaining economic production. With so many benefits to water-conservative crops, the only question then is getting farmers to actually plant them. This is where incentives come into play. Keep in mind that this concept is nothing new. For the past few decades, the government has used subsidies to bolster water-intensive commodities like corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton, and rice. The Cato Institute cites that direct government aid accounts for 39% of farm income and rose to a record $46.5 billion from $22.4 billion last year. Taking this into account, it's no surprise why farmers haven't pursued sustainable alternatives. Till now, there hasn't been a reason to. These federal funds are only available if you plant certain crops. So in order to survive, farmers will plant what the government tells them to. In this way, subsidies have, for lack of a better term, coercive power that influences agricultural behaviors. In order to fight our ongoing crisis, we need to change how money is distributed, and in doing so, change what's in the ground. Reallocating some of the subsidies or payments to sustainable crops is a step in the right direction. If we incentivize farmers to consider water-conscientious solutions, they will. Diverting current allocations will change the agricultural focus. We can take the same money set aside for water-wasting expenditures and redirect it to crops that promise a better future. Best of all, the resources are already available, having existed for decades. Therefore, it's with great hope that I urge a vote in the affirmative. Our water resources are worth saving. Encouraging sustainable crops over water-intensive ones can do just that. Thank you.
All right, Matthew.
Ethan, you talk about maintaining economic production while switching crops. How exactly are you going to maintain that economic production?
So what I'm trying to keep in mind is that sorghum, for instance, the ones that I mentioned, sorghum, teff, and prickly pear cactus, they all are types of feed grains. Understand that 41% of agriculture doesn't even go onto people's plates. They go into the mouths of animals. So we can have these same kind of crops with the same purpose and just substitute them into existing markets.
But how can you be sure that those crops and those animals are going to now transform with you into this new normal?
So there's actually some really keen evidence with regard to sorghum. Recent unprecedented demand was actually a strong signal for farmers to plant more sorghum this year. Nearly 7 million acres are projected to be seeded, up 18% from 2020, according to the USDA. So our nation is already accommodating to water-sustainable alternatives. And what we're doing is no different from trends we've already seen.
Thank you. And then you talk about subsidies, how subsidies have this type of coercive power into forcing farmers to transform what they're growing. Do you think that's immoral in any sense?
To an extent, I understand what you're saying. However, it's a system that has provided farmers with their livelihood for decades. I think in the early 1990s is when they started adding in these subsidies. And so what we're doing is we're just changing the focus. We're still providing them with their livelihoods the same way it has for the five main crops that I mentioned earlier. That would be corn, wheat, and soy. Except we're just changing where that focus is going. We're not depriving them of anything that they've had before.
Thank you.
All right, you ready? Make your negative argument here, Matthew?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
In Greek mythology, Poseidon is the god of the sea or water in general. He can make water appear out of thin air whenever he wants. We can use someone like that right now, considering the water issues we have. However, because of the fact that we don't live in Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson books, we have the responsibility of solving that problem ourselves. The Reno Gazette-Journal reports that across Nevada, agriculture is struggling. Weeds are taking hold on fallowed fields, and ranchers are selling off cattle their lands can no longer support. Crop insurance that has carried growers to the drought thus far is drying up, no longer available for many should the drought continue even longer. This is a problem and needs to be addressed and fixed as soon as possible. And my opponent Ethan agrees on this. However, we run into a dispute in terms of how to go about solving said issue. He believes that the way to solve the water issue is to convert the current crop options. However, the reality is that although the crops are a problem that needs to be solved, the more immediate problem that we need to address is rather the infrastructure of our current argument, of our current agriculture. This is what we need to fix instead. Allow me to elaborate. First, let's talk about the problem with the agriculture that is currently causing water issues, specifically on the way that the farmers are getting their water. Canals that serve as transport from groundwater to farm irrigations are in this negative loop. What negative loop? Allow me to explain. A recent canal during the drought of 2012 to 2016 has gone into said negative loop. What happens is that because of the drought and not because of the crops, farmers needed more water to sustain their crops. As a result, they needed more and more water. So naturally, they used this canal to draw more water. But because they were overdrawing the water and the canal couldn't support it, the canal instead sunk 12 feet and operating at 60% of its typical capacity. You can see how this leads into a negative loop. As farmers need more water, they draw from the canal, canal becomes a problem, gives less water, and as a result, the farmer then needs more water, so they keep drawing more and more. The canal keeps going more and more into this deficit of water. This isn't going to change by simply removing the crop that we're currently growing and instead growing something else. The Fresno Pete reports that it is currently taking $200 million to fix this canal. Here's the problem, is that the reason why we need to focus on infrastructure first isn't the fact that crops are not important. They are important. I'm arguing that the infrastructure is more important than the crops because of the factor that the crop economic production depends on the market. The market fluctuates ups and downs. However, the cost of fixing infrastructure problems is only going to go up as time continues. Thus, we must focus on infrastructure first. Next, allow me to explain some of the other problems that is not just on the ways of transporting water. Paying to fix the canal is getting worse continuously. However, that is not the only factor. We must also consider other factors that are the result of human poorly responsibilities that are causing crop agriculture to be bad. First, Global Newswise reports that severely invasive weeds have also ruined agriculture pivots. In several northern pivots, herds of wildlife such as antelope have also caused significant problems to plants. This shows that they took that much water to grow all these crops in agriculture to instead have no economic value or yield, meaning that we wasted all these water for no actual benefits. If we fix this with the infrastructure problems, we can instead be actually, quote unquote, using the water for a beneficial purpose without wasting water. Lastly, here's the solution that we should actually take into action instead of converting crops: converting the current water system. Conversion from flood irrigations, which is the current most commonly used irrigation methods in Nevada, to sprinkler irrigations provides many benefits to farming operations, including savings in water, energy, and labor. Within the conversion of sprinkler irrigation, producers are able to cover more ground more uniformly, which increases the overall efficiency of their operation. In most situations, conversion from flood to sprinkler irrigations will also result in an increase in crop yields. Irrigation efficiencies also increase the water efficiency from approximately 50 to 70% after conversion. This shows that this is clearly a way better way to go about solving our water problems. Voltaire writes that do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. My opponent Ethan seeks to say that alfalfa is genuinely a bad crop and he can maintain the current economic value after we switch to crops like sorghum. However, there is no guarantee, mainly because of the fact that maintaining economic production on a crop is dependent on the rest of the world. It is dependent on whether or not the farmers are actually going to then grow that crop, because ultimately, no matter how much subsidies you provide, no matter how much incentive you provide, ultimately it comes down to the farmer that actually decides to grow what they want in their crop. And seeing how dominant alfalfa is, like the Motor Intelligence reports, that how the United States currently has the largest market on alfalfa in the world, it is unlikely that any of the farmers will actually change what they're growing simply because Ethan is giving them money, which only isn't even a majority of their income, being only 39%. Thus, converging crops is not the way to go. And if we truly want to help the water conversion system and save water, we need to focus on the infrastructure. Thank you.
Ethan.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. So starting out, from your introduction, is it safe to say that you agree that our water crisis will get worse and worse without resolution?
Yes.
So I want to ask you, in particular, you mentioned weeds and antelopes, then provide a solution of sprinkler irrigation systems. How is that going to solve the problems that you listed?
So the irrigation systems, so my first point was how the water system is currently inefficient. My third point addresses that. When it comes to the invasive weeds and causing significant damage in herds of antelope, that is something the humans themselves need to do a better job at.
So are you listing out a problem that doesn't have a solution, that you don't provide a solution for?
The problem I'm solution is that in the severely invasive weeds, the problem, my case with that is saying that these things isn't going to change by converging crops. That was my point. Is by converging crops, these problems doesn't go away.
So you don't have a solution for those problems either?
No.
Thank you. Now, moving on, I'd like to ask the name of that canal.
The name of that canal,
You
I do
mentioned
not
a
have
canal.
the specific name for that canal.
Okay, that's great, thank you. Now, you also make a claim early on in your case that the drought and water shortage is caused by a lack of infrastructure. So are you saying that...
It's not a lack of infrastructure. It's that current infrastructure is damaged and needs to be fixed.
So are you saying that infrastructure contributes more to the water crisis than the actual lack of water itself?
I'm saying that by converging crops, you're not fixing the problem with infrastructure. Because infrastructure is only going to get worse and worse through on. Converging crops can be done at a later time after we fix infrastructure. My entire case is saying that we should fix infrastructure first before we conduct anything on the conversion of crops.
Infrastructure first, got it. Thank you.
Right.
At this point, is it okay if I take 45 seconds of prep?
Please. The debaters are allowed to take a little bit of time for prep in between the segments. When Ethan is ready, he will give a detailed rebuttal to what Matthew has said, and hoping not to incur the wrath of the god Poseidon, I assume.
Thank you.
All right.
At this point, I'd like to start off with my own case. My opponent makes two main remarks regarding my plan. Firstly, that farmers won't grow water-conservative crops, and secondly, that people won't buy them. With regard to the first point, I will agree that farmers do have the choice to grow what they want. There's no denying that. However, he overlooks the pivotal and complex role that subsidies actually play. I'd like to reiterate from my constructive that direct government aid accounts for 39% of net farm income and rose to a record $46.5 billion. Simply put, farmers need this money. It isn't the majority, but imagine living off of only 40% of your income. That's not feasible. By placing subsidies on water-conscientious alternatives like teff and sorghum, farmers will have to plant these crops if they want the funding that follows. Diverting money, therefore, becomes a powerful tool in influencing planting behavior. With regard to his second point, that people won't buy it, you have to put this in context. As of now, large markets exist for crops like alfalfa because traditionally, those are the kind of crops that people grow. Without the billions of dollars in funding, it's unreasonable to expect that consumers will know about teff to the same extent as, say, wheat, or that they'll be the same price. The whole point of my proposal is to change those ongoing dynamics. Already, there is popularity in the realm of sustainable crops. I mentioned this card in my cross-examination, and I'll mention it again. Recent unprecedented demand was a strong signal for farmers to plant more sorghum this year. Nearly 7 million acres are projected to be seeded. This is undeniable proof that water-conservative crops can be profitable. And the markets are already there. My opponent actually says so himself. Alfalfa is a valuable commodity, accounting for more than $196 million in Nevada. As other types of cattle crop, teff and sorghum will be bought in the same manner because they serve the same demand for livestock feed. It's also important to note that while he states that there will be economic fluctuations and we cannot guarantee overall income, you have to understand that the idea of subsidies is already accounting for that. The point of subsidies is to ensure farmers that even if there isn't an overall yield, they are still having a livelihood. Therefore, I already account for that in my own plan. Now, this ensures that incentivizing sustainable crops will remain a viable and necessary option. Now, I'd like to move on to my opponent's case, specifically highlighting why we should still focus on crop conversion. First off is the amount of money required. Farmers want to use less water. They have their livelihoods at stake during the water crisis. So if efficient infrastructure is such an obvious solution, why hasn't it been done? Well, the reason is simple: money. Installing more effective irrigation will require a massive investment, up to $10,000 per acre on farms of thousands of acres. Even fixing something as simple as the Friant-Kern Canal, the canal my opponent mentions, will cost up to $250 million. I won't deny that infrastructure is a good idea. It does have potential. However, it's equally true that we can't begin to rebuild when there's no money to rebuild with. That's part of why agricultural incentives are such an effective solution. With programs already in place, the only change is in the allocation of money. Infrastructure, on the other hand, would just burden government systems. The second problem with investing in infrastructure is the time span of actual impact. Our water shortages are a progressive crisis. My opponent even conceded that he agrees that our water crisis will get worse and worse without resolution. Yet, infrastructure isn't a timely fix, taking years before the benefits can actually be seen. My opponent explains how fields are literally drying up right now because farmers don't have the water to sow any crops. If help doesn't come for years, those individuals will suffer in the meantime. We do not have the privilege of waiting decades. Crop conversion is a solution with immediate effects. In comparison, infrastructure just isn't a reasonable investment. Now, in general, my opponent argues that we should put infrastructure first. However, crop conversion can actually kill two birds with one stone, resolving the concerns of my opponents and my own. Systems like canals are strained because of farmers overdrawing water. So, by decreasing the needs of crops, we decrease the burden on our infrastructure. Less water is less strain. And that means that there's no negative loop that my opponent mentions. When you remove the need for water, you remove the need to replace infrastructure. It's a win-win situation. For these reasons, I continue to affirm that agricultural subsidies are the right approach. We need to protect our water resources, and that begins with reducing the amount of water we use in agriculture. Thank you.
Matthew.
I would kindly request 45 seconds of prep time.
Of course. By the way, for people watching, we'd love for you to go into the chat and talk about what you think of these amazing high school debaters, who you think is doing well, who you think may or may not have an edge. I've already learned a lot. These two should be on the Colorado River Commission, don't you think?
Thank you.
All right.
First off, I like to begin with reaffirming my own case. Ethan attacks it by saying that, of course, we're going to have the same economic effects by converting crops. However, I once again reaffirm that that's not his call. He cannot magically say that converting crops will have the same economic effects, and then boom, they just have the same economic effects. Here's how we will actually be going into an economic deficit if we convert crops. In his own case, he points out that switching crops entirely is not what he's doing, and is not imaginable or realistic to actually do that. However, in his rebuttal, he brings up that the only reason why the farming industry will work after we switch crops is because the old option will no longer become unavailable. This is simply false because he negates that by saying that that's not what he's doing. which means now after if we switch crops, farmers and cattle now have an option of which one they want to buy or which one they have to pursue. And record and researchers and evidence shows that people will stick to alfalfa, the current economy. And by taking away subsidies from these farmers, you are basically saying that farmers are going to keep going the same exact thing, but you're taking money away from them. Of course, subsidies count for money, but I stress that 39% is not the majority of their income. And a portion of that will still stay with that subsidies, which means that there is not enough incentive, nor is there a guarantee that the economic factor afterwards will be the same. Hence why converting crops is not the most feasible solution. Next, I want to go on to a solution of money, saying how he agrees with me that the infrastructure is an important factor. However, the fact that it hasn't been done yet is because of money. I agree with this. This is why we need to do it right now. Because unlike converting of crops, infrastructure only gets more expensive as the day goes on. If we don't do this right now, in 10 years, it's going to cost exponentially more than it is today to fix our infrastructure system. Converting crops can be done at a later time when we have a more plausible solution and a better guarantee on the economic production afterwards. Second, I like to reaffirm my own case of saying how infrastructure is actually the key solution to this. My opponent stresses that converting crops will somehow be this magical solution and will get rid of our water problems. And yes, while I agree that crops is a major problem, that's not the feasible solution. The priority, like I stressed when he asked me this, my case is saying that the priority of our money and resources should be focused on infrastructure. Like I stated, infrastructure and converting the water systems will save water from 50 to 70% of what they're currently being used to grow crops. My opponent brings up this case and backs me up excellently when he says that currently farmers are letting their fields go fallow. Switching crops won't solve that because you can't grow crops without water. This is why these fields are going fallow, not because the farmers are intentionally letting these fields not grow anything. They simply don't have water, period. And it is not that they don't have enough water. Like I pointed out in my canal, it's simply that they don't have water, period. You can't grow crops when you don't have any water. By fixing the infrastructure and by providing more and more water, we can make certain that these cases will actually get more water, like I bring up in my own case, saying how land that was once used for ditches and other fallow fields can now be converted into productive cropland if we fix the infrastructure, therefore negating his point about how crops will actually decrease the water consumption. Next, let's move on to how he says that by converging crops and lessening the need of water, this fixes the problem. However, it doesn't. By converting the crops, that crop itself might need less water. However, the infrastructure and the problems within the infrastructure still exists. By converting crops, you're not fixing the root of the problem, which is the infrastructure. Sure, like his studies pointed out, that alfalfa might take more water than other alternatives. The problem being is that it is simply not a feasible plan and non-realistic compared to if we just fix the infrastructure, something that cannot be done at a later time because it will get more expensive. So instead, we should fix the infrastructure first and then worry about the crops. That is the case that I'm pushing today, and that is the case that you should agree with. Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, it's time for what is known, I gather, as the Grand Crossfire, which is somewhat more civilized than the crossfire that used to be on CNN. So have at it.
The affirmative, like the first question.
Yes, please. Thank you. So my first question is, I'm going to ask, you talk about the effect of infrastructure, and you state that it's going to have an increase of 50 to 70% efficiency.
Yes.
So if I can prove that crop conversion is in fact more efficient, has an in fact more efficient impact, isn't that proof that we should support crop conversion over infrastructure?
No. Simply because if you switch crop, like I said, I agree with that some alternatives are more water consuming than alfalfa. Here's the thing, once you start growing that crops, you're still wasting a lot of water because of the infrastructure and because of how they're growing. So you're not solving that problem, in which if you don't solve that problem, no matter what crop you grow, you're still wasting water. Now let's move on to your case. You talk about maintaining the economic system. So I want to stress out this point of how you say that we're going to maintain economic sorghum. Like you stated, Ethiopia and other competitors are already growing these dominant alternative crops to alfalfa. How can you ensure that, and my question is now how can you ensure that people will grow this crop? Is how can you ensure that by growing this crop, you're going to bring in the same economic effects as alfalfa?
So I'm going to again return to my piece of data from the USDA, and it's talking about sorghum demand. I also want to point out that altogether, China is buying an immense amount of sorghum, and that is proof that there is a market for it. And even if there wasn't, the environmental benefits would still outweigh the economic costs. According to the University of Arkansas, agriculture actually only represents 0.9% of Nevada's total GDP. 0.9%. For an industry that occupies nearly half of the Colorado River's water, that's a clearly disproportionate expense. So even if I don't recoup the entire economic benefit, the environmental cost would still be worth.
It's not a matter of how much percentage it is. It's a matter of can you bring in the same amount of revenue afterwards.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yes.
Okay. Like I said, I've already provided proof that there is a market available. And it's not necessarily a market for just alfalfa, because people aren't necessarily buying just alfalfa. It's more of an indicator of the demand for feed grains, in which sorghum and teff are a viable alternative still.
Thank you.
All right, gentlemen, we're ready for the final segment, am I correct? Where we're
Yes.
going to have rebuttals from each of you, and I believe that Matthew goes first in this part, and Ethan gets to wrap it up.
Yes. Thank you. After that cross-sex, I like to make some new points. The main focus of that cross-sex was the economic benefits of alfalfa versus the other crops. However, I'd like to stress that once again, my partner Ethan does not control what the demand is. He states that there is currently a market for alternatives such as sorghum and teff. However, and he says that China has an increase in demand in this. However, he wasn't able to supply me with where are they getting this so much amount of these alternative crops from. Because it clearly shows that when there's such a high demand, that there is already competitors going into that field. Why would we convert our crops into a crop that we have to compete with others with when the current crop is a crash crop of Nevada providing $196 million in revenue and also is the most dominant market that we have in the United States? Like Immortal Intelligence reports that currently United States is the most dominant market for alfalfa, and it is likely to retain that position in the forecast period of 2021 of 2026. This is why switching from alfalfa simply doesn't make sense, when instead, like I pointed out, the problem could instead be fixed by infrastructure. I say it again, in cross-sex, he asked me the question of how saving 50% water is going to be more relevant if he can provide me with the evidence that switching crops can be more efficient. However, my response to that is, although switching crops can be more efficient, the problem is that right now, they don't have water, period. Right now, these farmers can't grow crops. Like I said with my canal evidence, is that canal is still currently broken. The government is spending $200 million to fix that canal. And until it gets fixed, they can't get water, period. And I like to stress the fact that these fallows, once again, are not going fallow because the farmers have a choice. They have no choice but to let these crops go fallow because there's no water. So after we fix the infrastructure, like I bring up, we are creating more farmland. We are fixing the fact that they can get more water and can get more water efficiently, so that the root of the problem is fixed. And then we can fix and go on to what we're actually growing in said crop fields. Because my opponent wants to push the case that we should do crops first instead of infrastructure. I'm pushing the case that we should do infrastructure first before crops, because of the fact that if you switch crops first without fixing the infrastructure, the root of the problem is still there. Thus, we have to fix the root of the problem before we fix the crops. Do not let the perfect, which is what my opponent is pushing, let the be enemy of the good, which is what I'm pushing, that after the infrastructure, we will have a solid enough water efficiency system to then, and only then, convert crops. Thank you.
Ethan.
Is it all right if I take the 45 seconds?
Of course you can.
Thank you.
There's no more prep. What are you doing?
Ethan's taking some more prep time. Matthew is reveling in the fact that Ethan has to take prep time. I have to tell you, for someone who's been jaded by covering politicians for almost 40 years, to have two fresh-faced, smart, thoughtful thinkers here talking about an issue, I can only hope that some of the politicians who deal with these kinds of issues are watching this. As I said, I'm hopeful. Ethan.
This debate essentially boils down to three main issues. First, whether we should put infrastructure or crop conversion first. Second, whether there's actual profitability to crop conversion. And third, whether infrastructure is an actual feasible endeavor. Moving to that first issue of whether infrastructure needs to be accomplished before we can move to crop conversion, I continue to stress that we can kill two birds with one stone here. Crop conversion reduces water, and in doing so, reduces the toll on infrastructure. We have two solutions in one. And that's important because that means I solve for the concerns of my opponents while also solving my own concerns. And infrastructure can't provide that. Infrastructure only provides for the infrastructure, meaning that the continued use of water-intensive crops will continue to be a problem. In this way, infrastructure shouldn't be put first. It should be crop conversion. Secondly, is the issue of if there's actual profitability to crop conversion. Now, my opponent says that there's magic going on here, and I can't make people buy things. And yes, there is no magic. However, I would like to stress once again that China is buying immense amounts of sorghum, and that was actually why we had so much unprecedented demand, as I mentioned earlier. Additionally, teff is very common on European markets, largely for health reasons. And so it's very important to note that there will be profitability to these crops. And now my opponent continues to point out that alfalfa is a cash crop and we have a dominant market, so why switch? However, I want to re-emphasize that we're not hyper-focusing on alfalfa. This debate isn't about alfalfa or teff or sorghum. It's about water-conservative crops versus water-intensive crops. And so I'd also like to point out that alfalfa only accounts for 0.9% of Nevada's total GDP, meaning that it's not as dominant as my opponent claims. If there is a hit there, it can take the hit, especially when it takes up 50% of the Colorado River's water. Now, regarding the third point of infrastructure and whether it's feasible, there's undeniable proof that infrastructure is not a feasible solution. And this breaks down into three main ways. First is the money, second is the effects, and third is the timeliness. With regard to money, my opponent states that it's going to cost more money if the situation gets worse. However, I'd like to take a step back and consider that if you change the amount of strain on infrastructure, the situation won't get worse, because when you waste less, you use your infrastructure less, meaning that we aren't having a gradually depreciating situation here. What we're doing is, by influencing crops, we influence infrastructure. And so the cost is still going to be magnitudinal, and we can't excuse that. Again, I'd like to reiterate one of my numbers, $250 million for the Bryant-Kern Canal that my opponent mentions. That is not justifiable. Now, moving on to the effects, I'd like to point out that my opponent states that a change in sprinklers can cause a 20% increase in water efficiency. Meanwhile, crops like teff, sorghum, and prickly pear can reduce usage by 30%, 50%, and 80%. That's a far larger reduction. So we should focus on the solution that actually has an impact and that can not only accommodate for one problem, but two. Finally, I'd like to focus on the timeliness of infrastructure. My opponent wants to talk about magic, so let's talk about magic. We can't sit for decades and expect everything to be okay. We can't expect the Bryant-Kern Canal to magically appear over the course of 2 days. It is an endeavor that will take years, and it is a long-term endeavor. We need solutions that affect now, and we need solutions that are reasonable. Therefore, I affirm that we still need to focus on crop conversion and agricultural subsidies, because our water is worth saving, and the only way we can save it as of now is through crop conversion. Thank you.
Gentlemen, that was fantastic. I wish we had a live audience so you could have some applause. I certainly applaud you. We do have a lot. What do you know? I think there's a relative out there. Full disclosure. Gentlemen, thank you so much for that in-depth debate. I'm really impressed by your preparation and knowledge. Before you go, I want to bring Elizabeth Thompson, my managing editor, up, who has a reward for both of you. And no, it's not an appointment to the Colorado River Commission, as I indicated.
So we'd like to thank the Nevada Realtors for sponsoring this entire debate. Thank you. And then we have sponsors for each of these 2 scholarship checks for $2,500. We're so pleased with what our listeners just got to hear and see. Thank you so much.
Please, Elizabeth, I hate to interrupt you, but look, I want you gentlemen to look at this chat. It's going crazy with compliments from our viewers, and they're well-deserved. Proud that these young men are Nevadans. Great debate. Congrats to you both. And that was from Daniel Rothberg, who may be the only person in Nevada who knows more than you guys about this topic. It's excellent debate from legendary journalist Paula Francis. Smart, respectful debate. Love it. What a concept. I'm really proud of both of you. Thanks again for coming. I'm sorry to interrupt, Elizabeth.
No, that's okay. That was great. I'm delighted to see all those comments, and maybe you'll be hearing from some colleges as well if they see that. So $2,500 check for each of these young men. One of them generously sponsored by the Vegas Chamber, and one sponsored by IGT. Thank you very much. I'll let you hand a check to, I'm sure, your friend, despite the spicy and intense debate. Thank you, gentlemen, so much. We really enjoyed that. I enjoyed it personally
as well. All right. Thanks again.
Take care.